Hi, good evening, everybody. It's great to see all of you. I think we still have some people filtering in, but we are going to get started. So, I'm Judy Greenspan. I'm Director of Public Programs at the Center for Jewish History. And on behalf of the Center, our partner organizations, the American Jewish Historical Society and the American Sephardi Federation, along with our co-sponsor tonight, the Jewish Book Council, we are so pleased to welcome you to our program this evening and to a conversation we've been looking forward to for many months. Journalist and author Matti Friedman is here tonight with Wall Street Journal reporter and author Lucette Lagnado to discuss Matti's new book, Spies of No Country, Secret Lives at the Birth of Israel. Released last week, the book tells the unknown story of 4 of Israel's first spies, all young Mizrahi men recruited by a unit known as the Arab Section during Israel's War of Independence. It's very tempting for me to give a book report about such a great book, but with such an interesting conversation in front of us, I'm only going to add that the great reviews Matti is currently receiving for his book were preceded by a major award for his manuscript. Matti won the 2018 Natan Book Award at the Jewish Book Council, a pre-publication award for Spies of No Country, and in a moment, Felicia Herman, the executive director of the Natan Fund, will tell us more about this award, the extraordinary Jewish Book Council, and she'll introduce both of our speakers tonight. For us, it's a delight to have 2 such masterful storytellers in conversation here this evening. Tonight's program is part of our series, First Person, a series that brings personal stories to our stage that open a window onto history, something Matti and Lucette do so well. Telling our stories, looking to the past to make sense of the present, is central to our mission here at the Center for Jewish History. So before we begin, I'd like to share a few words about where we are tonight. Do we have anyone in the audience who has never been here before? Just a few. Okay, so I'll be quick. So then you all know that the Center is actually a rare gem in this city. It's a world-renowned research institute for scholars of Jewish history, a destination for public programs, concerts, exhibitions, a place to explore your genealogy, and the Center for Jewish History is home to our 5 partner organizations and their extraordinary archival collections. Our partners, the American Jewish Historical Society, the American Sephardi Federation, the Leo Baeck Institute, Yeshiva University Museum, and the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research, together possess the largest repository of Jewish archival material outside of Israel. I think it's very safe to say that many New Yorkers walking past this building on West 16th Street have no idea that tucked away inside is an astonishing treasure trove of materials that span more than 500 years of history and include millions of documents, hundreds of thousands of books, thousands of artworks, ritual objects, recordings, and film. So in other words, this building is quite literally filled to the brim with stories. Here's a glimpse of what that looks like, if you can see that. In the 12-story building behind ours, behind this one, this is part of just one floor of one partner's archives, this one belonging to the American Jewish Historical Society. And not surprisingly, and very briefly, relative to tonight's talk, you could spend hours finding materials from pre-1948 Palestine in our partners' collections. So from the collections of Yeshiva University Museum, the Haganah poster from 1948, from the collections of the American Sephardi Federation, a book published in 1880 called Picturesque Palestine, and from the Leo Baeck Institute, the artist Herman Struck left many, many of his beautiful watercolors. This is a Palestine sunset, Yemenite Jew praying, and a pioneer in Palestine sketched in 1924. Best of all, these collections are not meant to be hidden away. Our online collections are accessible to everybody in this room, as are our reading room and library and genealogy institute. Exhibitions, public programs, conferences draw from and showcase the treasures and stories in this building. So on your way out today, please sign up for our mailing list, pick up flyers of our upcoming programs, including our next 2 first-person programs. Grab the brochure about the New York Sephardi Film Festival, which is playing here now, and if you'd like to see Matti again, he is in the film The Lost Crown, playing here on March 16th, which chronicles the story he tells in his second book, The Aleppo Codex. So we hope you come back again and often. We'll have Q&A with Matti and Lucette at the end of their conversation, and after the program, there will be a book signing and reception in the Great Hall. Please join me now in welcoming the Executive Director of the Natan Fund, Felicia Herman. Thank you.
Thanks, Judy. So, it's truly an honor to be able to introduce our speakers to you tonight, Matti Friedman and Lucette Lagnado, 2 of the most talented journalists and memoirists writing about the Jewish experience today. But don't just take my word for it. We have the Jewish Book Council here. Matti and Lucette have both won the Jewish literary world's most prestigious award, the Jewish Book Council's Sammy Rohr Prize. Matti for the Aleppo Codex, his first book, the gripping true story of the adventures of an ancient copy of the Hebrew Bible, yes, and Lucette for her poignant memoir of her Egyptian Jewish family, The Man in the White Sharkskin Suit. Both of these books, and the book that they're here to talk about tonight, Matti's new Spies of No Country, place at their center the stories of Jews from the Muslim world, often called Mizrahi or Sephardic Jews, who lived across the Middle East and North Africa for centuries. These communities all came to a catastrophic end in the decades following 1948, as Muslim and Arab countries responded to the creation of the State of Israel and many other upheavals by turning on their local Jewish populations, attacking them, appropriating their wealth, and expelling them either implicitly or explicitly. About 850,000 Jews left the Middle East and North Africa, with about 600,000 of them settling in the nascent yet struggling country of Israel. Most of the rest settled in Europe, especially France, and also in the Americas. This massive population shift created an unprecedented interaction between major populations of Jews who had never lived together before, sort of like the center actually brings together major archives of Jews who had never lived together before, the Ashkenazi Jews from Europe, and these hundreds of thousands of Jews from across the Middle East and North Africa who were not only very different from the Ashkenazim, but were also very different from each other. So I have the great honor of introducing the speakers tonight because first, I'm a proud board member of the American Jewish Historical Society, a co-sponsor of tonight's event. And also because, as Judy mentioned, Matti's new book, Spies of No Country, is a 2018 winner of the Natan Book Award. Natan, the foundation that I run, is a little different than most foundations. It's not a single family or an individual. It's a giving circle, a group of wonderful people here in New York who pool their charitable resources and decide together which causes they want to support. And the thing that connects all of our grants around the world, in Jewish communities around the world and in Israel, is that we fund innovation. We brought our work into the literary realm a few years ago when we started the Natan Book Award. And thus far, it has only had 2 winners, Ari Shavit's My Promised Land, and now Matti Friedman's Spies of No Country. The award is a pre-publication prize, so most of our efforts are concentrated on getting the book out into the world in creative ways and in front of audiences that might not otherwise encounter it. And we're very proud to partner with the Jewish Book Council on this award. The Jewish Book Council, we share their mission of enriching and educating people through Jewish literature. The Jewish Book Council is a treasure, hosting awards, conferences, and public programs like this one, publishing essays and interviews with Jewish authors, especially in its excellent journal Paper Brigade, and offering extensive resources to book clubs and anyone, really, who wants to engage with Jewish literature. So when our Book Award committee members selected Matti's manuscript for the Book Award well over a year ago, they did it because it was clear that the story that Matti was telling would upend many myths about Israel's creation. Both the often whitewashed, oversimplified stories told by those of us who love Israel, and the calumnies told by those who don't. And it would do so through what's called history from the bottom up, something that Lucette and Matti both excel at, using what seem like small stories of ordinary people to illustrate much larger themes. Lucette Lagnado has written 2 award-winning memoirs that use this approach, telling the story of Mizrahi Jewry through the lens of her own family, whose grand and vibrant life in Cairo came to an end in 1963 when they were forced to leave Egypt essentially penniless, first for France and ultimately for America. The Man in the White Sharkskin Suit focuses primarily on her cosmopolitan, larger-than-life father, while its companion memoir, The Arrogant Years, juxtaposes her own story of growing up in Brooklyn with that of her mother's coming of age in Egypt. Lucette is working on a new book about Jews from Arab lands called And Then There Were None, which I'm sure she'll talk about tonight. And in her day job, as if that wasn't enough, she's a health and medicine reporter for the Wall Street Journal, and she manages to sneak in some wonderful pieces about Jews every now and then. She's also the co-author of Children of the Flames, Dr. Joseph Mengele, and The Untold Story of the Twins of Auschwitz, which has been translated into nearly a dozen languages. History from the bottom up is also especially valuable, I think, when it comes to telling stories about Israel, as Matti Friedman does. Israel is a very complex place, and the ways that people tend to talk about it seem not only to miss the real story of the country, but often even seem to be just happening on some alternate universe that doesn't even exist. As Matti said in his acceptance speech for the Sammy Rohr Prize, a deep connection to Israel can be formed only by an intimacy with the real life of the real people of different faiths living in this country, where the miraculous renaissance of the Jews plays out in strange and surprising ways every day. Matti has offered his readers manifold opportunities to connect with Israel as a real place on the planet Earth, as he said to us a few weeks ago in Jerusalem. And through articles in publications such as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, and Tablet. And I want to especially recommend to you 2 phenomenal articles that he wrote in the last few years, one for the Atlantic and one for Tablet, dissecting the international media's unrelenting obsession with Israel. His 2 previous books, The Aleppo Codex and Pumpkin Flowers, about his experiences as an Israeli soldier in the Second Lebanon War, won multiple awards and have been listed in several Best Books of the Year lists from publications like the New York Times, Book List, and Mother Jones. And now, thanks to Spies of No Country, we can add yet another set of complex, real-life stories to this mix. Those of a handful of ordinary Mizrahi Jews in the 1940s who, because their identities enabled them to blend between cultures, found themselves thrust into extraordinary circumstances that shaped the contours of Israeli spycraft and probably Israel itself forever. So please welcome Lucette Lagnado and Matti Friedman.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I don't know if we can live up to it. Let's
sure,
try.
either. Well, hi. Can everybody hear me? Or? Yeah? I'm sorry. All right. Well, so let's begin. I'd like to begin with the personal. We were given such great introductions about your work, completely deserved. But Matti, I'd like to know a little bit about you. You're Canadian, you're in Israel, your name is Matti, except when you called me this afternoon, I think you said this is Matthew. And so who are you? And how did you get to be the chronicler of my people, the Jews of Arab lands?
First of all, thank you so much for being here. Your memoir is one of my favorite books, and Lucette Lagnado is one of the great writers in the Jewish world. And thank you so much for coming tonight. Who am I is a great question. I'm not sure. I don't get into it too much. I think one reason that I'm a journalist is that I'm more interested in other people. And I don't know if I have that much interesting to say about myself. But I was born in Toronto. I lived there until I was 17. I got out of there as soon as I could legally leave. Went to Israel for a year to work on a kibbutz. Spent a year milking cows on a very small religious kibbutz called Ma'alei Gilboa. I don't know if anyone's been there. Most people haven't. And then I spent a few months there and declared that I was never leaving, and I haven't, basically. And that was 23 years ago. And since then, I worked in agriculture for a while, and then I got drafted, which is what happens in Israel if you're a citizen. And I served 3 years in an infantry unit, and then went to study Islamic studies at Hebrew University, became a journalist, spent most of my time as a journalist working for the AP in the AP's Jerusalem bureau, struck out on my own at the end of 2011, and wrote a few books, the most recent of which came out last week.
But I was curious, in fact, about your background in Canada. Did you come from an observant family, from a very passionately cultural Jewish family? I mean, what made you? I think you're very unique. Your writings have emerged as very unique, and I would echo what was said. In particular, sort of some of your writings about the media and how unfair some of us have been on the state of Israel. I'm just curious where that all emanated from in Toronto.
So you're demanding introspection, which is my...
A little bit.
I grew up in a very multicultural city. Toronto is really a very unique place. If you grow up in Toronto, you think that the whole world is Toronto. But actually, it's just Toronto, as you find out when you leave Toronto. But I grew up in public schools and had a very kind of ethnically varied group of friends. But I came from a traditional Jewish home. So I was a student in a public school, but I wore a kippah, for example. And
Did you really?
But my friends weren't really Jewish. And it was a very unique childhood in that way. And I didn't really respect ethnic barriers as being important, and I had that kind of Canadian childhood. And then I went to the Middle East and was kind of gripped by this incredible kind of the energy of the country, and found myself in a place that's very different, right? The boundaries are very clear, and it's a much more fractious place, and it's harder to cross those lines. And I became Israeli. I've been there since I was 17. I served in the military. I married an Israeli. I have Israeli kids. But at the same time, I've remained kind of Canadian, and I can toggle those identities in ways that have been useful for me as a journalist. For example, when I wrote Pumpkin Flowers, which is in part a memoir and a nonfiction book about a military outpost where I served as an Israeli soldier in South Lebanon, I could then take my Canadian passport, claim that my name is Matthew Friedman and not Matti Friedman, and go back to Lebanon to report it. And that was that book. It was those two identities. And I think that that experience, which is seemingly unrelated to this book, actually has a lot to do with it, because I also have a double identity, as many people do. And in fact, almost everyone is playing a kind of complicated identity game and playing up certain things at one time and other things at another time. It's certainly true of Jewish people, who often have more than one name and kind of complicated identities that they play with. But I think it's a kind of a facet of human nature, and that's what's interesting about a spy story, which is that it's a story about people doing something crazy that most of us are never going to do, but it's also a story about something that we all do all the time.
Right. I know I'm completely fascinated by how you've homed in this book on the idea of the double identity, and there's much that I want to ask you about this, but we'll take it one step at a time. I think what's really wondrous about what you've done, about what you flagged in the Times piece, and of course a centerpiece of this book, is the kind of enormous Arab Jewish population in Israel, which we've tended to see, I think through very kind of cliched terms, the kibbutznik, whose family came from Russia, or, Holocaust survivor. And certainly there's an enormous number. But there was also us. And we, and I speak as an Egyptian Jew, we're always kind of relegated. And here you have created in this book an amazing oeuvre about us. And I'd like to begin with a simple question. Even now, I was bothered by the use of the term Mizrahi Jews. I think of myself as a Sephardic Jew. I've always thought of the Jews of the Middle East as Sephardic Jews. And suddenly I'm being told, well, no, you're not exactly Sephardic, you're Mizrahi. I know it's not supposed to be derogatory, but I sort of experience it with a wince that I can't even explain. Can you kind of just delve in and tell us about that?
Sort
Because it
everything out?
Yeah.
Sure. Well, I mean, my family comes from Eastern Europe, right? My name's Friedman, so I'm not a voice for Jews who came from the Middle East, and anyone can define themselves absolutely however they want, and I would never say anything about it. The term that was used for a long time for Jews who came from the Islamic world was Sephardic, Sfaradi in Hebrew, but that technically means Jews who came from Spain. Sfarad is Spain, and the Sfaradim are Jews who were expelled from Spain after 1492. One of the great families expelled from Spain was Lagnado. Your family, so that is a Spanish name, and it even sounds Spanish, even though the Lagnados lived in Aleppo,
Right.
and then your parents moved to Cairo, or your grandparents moved to Cairo,
No,
as
my
many
father.
Aleppo Jews
My
did.
father, yeah.
Right, and your grandmother was a Syrian Jew, Halabi, right.
Yeah.
So that is a big part of of course, of the Jewish story, but there's a Middle Eastern Jewish world that predates the expulsion from Spain. In fact, it predates the arrival of Jews in Spain.
Right.
The Aleppo Jewish community, for example, is ancient by the time the Second Temple is destroyed in the year 70 CE, and there are always two Jewish communities in Aleppo, at least post-expulsion from Spain. One is the Sfaradim, families like Lagnado, and they call themselves Sfaradim, and the other part of the Jewish community is made up of Jews who've always been in Aleppo. They were there before Islam, and they were there before the Arab conquerors arrived, and they were there before Christianity. They've always been there. When the Arab conquerors kind of explode out of the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century and conquer Syria, the Jews who are already there, because they're one of the native communities of Aleppo, just as they were native across what later became the Islamic world, they adopt Arab culture. And they begin to refer themselves with a very interesting word, which has relevance to our story and also has relevance to fauda. If any of you are watching it, I know you're all readers, you read books all day, but if you occasionally put down the book and turn on Netflix and you're watching fauda, the agents in fauda, the secret agents who can assume Arab identities and operate on the other side of the line, are called mista'arvim. And that's a very interesting word, which has use in intelligence, but it predates Israeli intelligence. It's a word that Jews in places like Aleppo use to describe themselves. The Jews, the Arabized Jews of Aleppo, call themselves musta'arabin, ones who become like Arabs, which is a fascinating word. It exists in Arabic and exists in Hebrew, mista'arvim, and it's adopted by Israeli intelligence, and now is mostly in use in intelligence terms, even though it's much, much deeper and older. The term that's now mostly in use in Israel, Sfaradim, has kind of gone out of style. The term that's now mostly used for Jews from the Islamic world is Mizrahim. It's not pejorative. There's a whole kind of Mizrahi pride movement. What it technically means, though, is Eastern. Mizrach is the East. And the problem with the term is that if you look at a map, you'll see that a city like Casablanca, which is a classic Eastern city, is actually to the west of London. So there's no geographic logic to it.
Yeah.
And what we just need generalizations in order to have a conversation. So we say Ashkenazim for Jews who come from, which means technically German, but it means Jews who come from anywhere between Vilna and Vancouver, basically. If you're from the Christian world, you're an Ashkenazi, right? If you come from Christianity. And if you come from Islam, you're a Mizrahi. These terms are kind of ridiculous, and I don't use them unless I absolutely have to, but sometimes you have to.
Right. I'll try to make my peace with that. Or maybe I'll try
You
to...
don't have to. You are Lagnado. You can
Well,
say that
I
you're
am a
Sephardic.
Lagnado, but I don't know. I think that the Sephardic / Mizrahi Jews of Israel had a lot taken from them, and I sort of see this as, one more kind of little diss.
But calling Jews from places like Aleppo or places like, Tehran, calling them Sfaradim is an insult because, of course, they were there before the Spanish expulsion, right?
Okay.
They've always been there. They didn't come, the Jews of Aleppo, as a kind of an example of a classic Jewish community in the Middle East, they didn't come from anywhere. It's hard to kind of imagine, I imagine the crowd's mostly Ashkenazi, like my family.
Right.
They didn't come from anywhere. They had always been there, always. So calling them Sfaradim as if they arrived yesterday in 1492, that's an insult. And in fact, calling them Jews of the Islamic world is also, they were there before Islam. And calling them Jews of the Arab world, they were there before Syria was Arab. So it's a more complicated story.
I guess so. Before we plunge in, I wondered if you would give us a taste of your book by reading a couple of pages. I think those in the audience who have not yet had a chance to have the book, since it's only been on sale.
I'm sure they've all read it.
I'd love to hear a couple of your favorites.
Sure, I'll read a very brief, piece of it, and only because you're making me, Lucette.
Yeah.
This is from the preface. It's just an attempt to kind of explain what I was about. Espionage, John le Carré once observed, is the secret theater of our society. Countries have cover stories and hidden selves just like their spies, and our clandestine basements conceal insights into the world above ground. Beyond an affinity for tales of secret agents and double identities, this observation is one reason I was drawn to these men and their strange adventure. Who they are has something important to tell us about the country they helped to create. The years of my acquaintance with Isaac, who's one of the 4 spies at the center of this book, turned out to be the years of the great Arab collapse and the destruction of Aleppo, the city of his birth and childhood in the Syrian civil war. We watched it happen from interview to interview. At the time of our first meeting in 2011, Aleppo was peaceful, and only the synagogues were empty, as they had been since Isaac's family and the city's Jews fled decades before with the great Jewish exodus from the Arab world. But soon Aleppo's churches were empty and many of the mosques, and much of the great Arab metropolis was in ruins. We saw people making desperate escapes across the Mediterranean, washing up on Greek beaches, trudging inland with their packs and babies. Throughout the Middle East, the Christians, Zoroastrians, Mandaeans, and Yazidis were going or gone, as well as Sunni Muslims who once lived among Shiites, and Shiites who once lived among Sunnis, and people who think or act differently and don't have a tribe that can protect them. The hatred of people who aren't like you, the idea that something will be solved if only such people can be made to disappear, this sometimes starts with Jews, but tends not to end there. One of my conversations with Isaac took place not in his kitchen, where I spent a lot of time interviewing him, but at a mall in his neighborhood where much of the population has roots in the Islamic world, like Isaac, and like half of the Jews in Israel. On the top floor was a video arcade with flashing blue lights, electronic explosions, and crazed parents driven here by summer vacation and the unbearable stickiness outside. The McDonald's was full, and so was a plastic playground in the atrium. At a shop called Aphrodite, scarlet bras were on sale. A woman in orange-rimmed glasses contemplated a lotto form. The children of the Jewish quarters of Tunis and Algiers were here in Ray-Bans and running shoes. The Jews of Mosul in northern Iraq were also here, not in Islamic State ditches with their neighbors, the Yazidis, but drinking lattes in the air conditioning, eating kosher McNuggets as their kids howled in Hebrew on the trampolines. These were Israelis, but not the kibbutz pioneers of the old Zionist imagination, orphaned children of Europe. These were people from the Islamic world, in the Islamic world, their lives entwined with the fate of the Islamic world, like the lives of their grandparents' grandparents. This was Israel, but an Israel not visible in the way the country is usually described. At a chain cafe by the escalators sat the spy, Isaac Shoshan, formerly Zaki Shasho of Aleppo, also known as Abdul Karim Muhammad Sidki of Beirut. When he recounted how he saw Israel born, the story had none of the usual characters and sounded unlike any I'd heard, but explained more about the present than any I'd heard. It was a Middle Eastern story. When I left the mall, the streets themselves seemed different, and that's when I decided this was a story whose time had come.
Beautiful. I'm completely mesmerized by your choice of these characters that history had ignored until you came along. The Arab section, I believe, is the name of this spy section that you chose to really investigate and bring to life for us. The Arab section was the name given to the spies who came from the Arab world and would be, in a sense, sent back to the Arab world. They had escaped to try to, in effect, fight for the emerging state of Israel. Before we talk about the Arab section, I'd like to just have you explore with us this amazing perspective you have on the modern state of Israel. This idea that the world tends to look at it through one lens, but it's not the truth really, because there were so many refugees from the Arab world that went into making the Jewish state. So it's, in a sense, it's been kind of unfair all these years that, that we never got, is that the word, the credit for helping to found the state. So if you just talk about that, because I just thought it was an amazing perspective.
Thank you. I mean, I think that, yes, it's unfair, but the book is not necessarily written to...
it's not political.
Or to rectify an unfairness, even though I truly believe that that's true. I think it's unfair to ourselves not to understand the country.
Right.
So I'm an Israeli journalist, and if I want to understand Israel, then this is a story, I think, or the story of the Jews who came from the Islamic world, is not something that can be relegated to a footnote or treated as if it kind of is some kind of marginal piece of the action. It's at least half of the story, if you understand that half of the Jews in Israel came from the Islamic world. And because we are in the Islamic world and our lives are shaped by our contact with Islam, and because the Jews of the Middle East have played such an important role in the creation of Israeli identity and society in very interesting ways, I would argue that that half of the Israeli population, or that segment, is actually the dominant segment, and that this is the important story in 2019. When I came to Israel in 1995, I had very simple stories about Israel, as I think many of us do. They were very European stories, so I knew Theodor Herzl in Vienna, and I knew the pogroms in Europe, and socialism, and the rise of the kibbutz idea, and of course I knew about the Holocaust, and I knew that's what I had in my head when I went. The problem is, if you go to Israel with your eyes open, those stories don't explain the country. If you stand on a street in Tel Aviv and you look at the people walking by on the street, they don't look like they're from Vienna. And if you try to figure out who's Jewish and who's Arab, it's tricky. It's not always apparent. The Judaism of the State of Israel is very Middle Eastern. It has a very Middle Eastern style. If you turn on pop radio in Israel, you're likely to hear Middle Eastern pop music, which we call Mizrahi music, Eastern music, which is a kind of interesting blend of styles, but it's Middle Eastern. If you try to understand our politics, which is very difficult, and I myself fail, but if you try to understand them through a European or a Western lens, you won't get very far. You have to understand it through a Middle Eastern lens and understand that the political thinking of Israelis, not just Israelis who come from the Islamic world, but the political thinking is shaped by our existence in the Middle East, and certainly half of the families in Israel brought with them in 1948 a very long memory of their existence inside the Islamic world as a minority. It didn't start in 1948 for them. The tension or the war, or whatever you want to call it, with Islam did not begin with the creation of the State of Israel. It began many, many centuries before. They lived as a minority. There were good times, there were bad times, eventually there were terrible times, and they had to leave, and they were forced out of their homes, and their property was taken. And that shapes the way that people see the Arab world today. And if you don't understand that half of the Jews in Israel have that in their background, then you won't understand our political behavior. So I've been thinking over the past couple of years that we need more stories. We need better stories about the state, stories that will actually explain the way the state of Israel exists, not the way our imagination wants to exist. It's not pioneers around the bonfire. I have incredible respect for people like David Ben-Gurion and Golda Meir, who in my mind are geniuses and heroes to whom I owe everything, just so I'm not misconstrued. I think that the genius of the early Zionist movement is only being proven more and more as time goes on. But I don't think stories about them really explain very much about the country today. I think that we'd be better served now in 2019 by maybe thinking less about the Warsaw Ghetto and more about Aleppo, less about David Ben-Gurion and Golda Meir, and more about Isaac Shoshan and his comrades Jamil Cohen and their complicated identities and the game that they were playing at the creation of the state.
Your words are music to my ears.
This is the best interview ever.
And I know you've taken great pains, as I do, to say you didn't write this book to make any kind of political statements. This is really a literary, historical journalistic work, but still, and you have a wonderfully, maybe it's the AP reporter in you. You have a wonderful kind of neutrality about you, which I appreciate a lot. That said,
the trick, by the way, is to make the reader think you're neutral while actually smuggling in lots of political messages. That's what journalists really do, by the way, in case people don't know.
And more on that and on about what some of your exposés, which I found to be, some of your greatest work, But I was stunned, and I mean stunned, reading your book about what you revealed, what you disclosed about the treatment of the Jews from Arab countries within Israel. And I'd like to say, we're all in the family here. This is not, God forbid, a pro-BDS crowd. I love Israel with an enormous passion. My sister, who's in the audience, would say the same, I'm sure. And yet, to read that some of the spies were known as quote-unquote black, because that's how they were perceived, to read in one absolutely haunting anecdote, there were some children from Syria who came who needed to be adopted versus, I believe, a group of children, I don't remember what they were, from Eastern Europe. And nobody wanted the Syrian children. I mean, oh my God, this is my country. And it brought Matthew, it brought back memories, and not good memories either. It brought back memories of my uncle Felix, my mother's brother, who went to Israel while we went to America, and went on to tell us that he had helped found the Black Panthers of Israel. And I was a little girl then and wondering what on earth are the Black Panthers of Israel, and he wrote with a sense of outrage and whatnot. And that is what this brought to mind. So I think even before we go on back to your book, you need to tell us, because I think you learned so much in researching.
I did. So the state is founded basically by Jews who come from Europe, mostly Eastern Europe. In the 1940s, before 1948, 9 out of every 10 Jews in pre-state Palestine is from Europe, mostly Eastern Europe, mostly native Yiddish speakers. And there's a very small minority of Jews who've come from the Islamic world. There are a few Syrians, there are some Yemenis, there are a few Jews who are native to places like Hebron, Jerusalem, Tzfat, Arabic speakers, some Ladino speakers, people who were always in the region. And the Zionist pioneers don't really know what to do with these people, because they have an idea of what Jews are, and this is not it. Jews speak Yiddish. Jews eat certain foods. They have a certain background. The Jewish world of Europe is much, much bigger than the Jewish world of Islam, and they've never seen anything like it. These people seem like Arabs, and they didn't know where to put them. So they're marginalized in the Zionist movement. They're kind of just, they're on the fringes of the action, and there are
literally fringes, right? Because they're the ones who are put in these tent camps and
after the founding of the state, right? So, but even before the founding of the state, there's no real place for them, because no one really thought about it, and there are kind of distressing incidents like the ones that you mentioned. And maybe if we just describe the life, the brief, the young life of one of my spies, Jamil Cohen, it will be indicative. Jamil grows up in Damascus, and he runs away, as some of these guys did. They run away to join the Zionist movement. They understand that the Arab world poses a threat to them. They understand that they're not going to be able to stand up straight if they remain there. And they hear about this very exciting thing going on in the land of Israel, and they run away to join it. Jamil Cohen ends up on a kibbutz. He wants to be a pioneer. That's his dream. He wants to be a new Jew along the lines imagined by the Zionist movement. So he stops calling himself Jamil, and he calls himself Gamliel. That's his Hebrew name. So he changes identities, and now he's a Hebrew-speaking Jew from the land of Israel. He's a pioneer on a kibbutz, and he leaves incredible discussions of what life on the kibbutz is like. He loves the people there. He's not fully accepted by them. The food stinks. He wants to hear Arabic music like Kulthum, but all they have are a few records that are symphonies from Europe, and this is terrible. But his peer group doesn't.
Yes, I totally identify with him.
His peer group doesn't fully accept him because he's strange. He's something very different. Right. So he's living on this kibbutz as a new Jew named Gamliel Cohen with varying degrees of success. In 1945, at the very end of the Second World War, when a recruiter arrives from the Arab section, which is a very amateur, ad hoc, seat of the pants, embryonic version of the Mossad. basically, but no one knows there's going to be a Mossad, no one knows there's going to be a state of Israel. It's hard to re-inhabit that mental space. In 1945, no one knows what's going to happen. Someone shows up on the kibbutz and they spot Gamliel, but they don't want Gamliel. They want Jamil, because what they need are people who can cross the ethnic lines and bring back intelligence. So Jamil, who has become Gamliel, gets a new identity, an Arab Muslim identity. He's called Yusuf al-Hamid, and he's dispatched into the Arab world, where he becomes eventually, after the story recounted in this book, he becomes one of Israel's greatest undercover agents. But that identity is respected in very few places in the Zionist movement of those years, except the intelligence world. In the intelligence world, Arab identity is useful and it's respected. And these lucky members or lucky exiles from that world kind of blunder into the only corner of the Zionist movement where they're really valued. In some ways, in the Palmach, they're part of the Palmach, which is the elite pre-state militia, which is largely Eastern European. These guys are kind of idolized as a kind of Superman that can cross this impassable ethnic boundary. They can become like Arabs. They're mistarvim. They can cross into Arab Haifa and blend in and bring back intelligence and then come back out, and they're on our side, but they seem like the other side, and it's something quite amazing in the years before 1948, but they're on the fringes of the action.
Right. It's funny, am I misremembering? But I think you have, again, it was for me a painful anecdote of, campfires or whatnot that were held where the regular, European Ashkenazim came, but then to listen to the music and enjoy, the Mizrahi Sephardic music. You see, you have me saying Mizrahi now too. But just leaving afterwards, not really being friends. So even within that world, there wasn't full integration, it seemed. To me, you were saying, I thought. I
describe an episode here that actually doesn't come from the Arab section, but it comes from another unit in the Haganah, which is the precursor to the Israeli army of Yemeni kids who are drafted to the Haganah. And they also have campfires where they sing Arab songs. And, and people are very interested in this because it's so different. And the Zionist pioneers are kind of in love with the Middle East in many ways. They like to wear a keffiyeh, and they like to sprinkle their Hebrew with Arabic words, which exist to this day.
Right.
A lot of the Arabic that's now in Hebrew came in through the Arab section. And a lot of Arabic music kind of makes its way into the Israeli psyche through the bonfires of the Arab section. But there is an element of, I think what in 2019 would be called othering. People come to see them, and they're interesting, and they're kind of exotic, but they're not really brought on as full-fledged leaders of the project. They're kept on the fringes as useful exotics, basically. And this only changes very, very gradually over many decades as the population of the state becomes something very different than the Zionist leadership had expected. The tragedy of Israel, of course, is that it's founded too late. We think of Israel as a triumph, and it is in many ways, but it's also a tragedy. It was founded too late. It was founded too late to save the people it was meant to save. Right. The Jewish world of Europe was supposed to go there, but everyone was murdered before they could get there, with the exception of very few people. And instead of becoming that European refuge, there's a wave of immigration from the Arab world and from the Islamic world, and it makes up half of the population of the state, and it changes the nature of the state. It changes the DNA of the state, and that's still playing out in very interesting ways, but it has taken 70 years, and the process is far from complete.
Right, and the other tragedy I would add is that one community after another in the Arab world, one Jewish community is destroyed. It's not destroyed as a Holocaust, but it's annihilated. There are no more Jewish communities left, or very few of them left in one country after another. So
you were just giving me an amazing number from your new book about Cairo.
Once upon a time, 80,000 Jews. Today, 4. I mean, it's chilling.
They probably go to different synagogues if I know if I know the Jews.
They would if they.
They're 4 and they don't talk to each other.
They would if they could. I find the name, the Arab section, such a gripping name. So I'm going to ask you 2 questions. One of them inappropriate, since your editor is in the room. But did you think of making that the title of the book? It has a kind of a John le Carré-like feel to it, number 1. And number 2, I'd like to know how you found it and became so obsessed with it. I really can see it as a Le Carré kind of enterprise.
Thank you. My editor is here, Amy Gash from Algonquin Books, the best editor in New York, which means she's the best editor in the world.
Except for mine.
The name of this book was a saga that I don't want to describe because it took us months, and we're still fighting about it. I think we did consider calling it the Arab section.
Really?
I have that memory, and I think that it.
Oh, so I'm not crazy. Okay.
No. I think that can we still change it? I'm not sure. No, we can't change it. Yes, that's Michael, the PR king at Algonquin. I think there's something evocative about the word spies. The story is broader than, it's about something very specific about 4 members of the Arab section, but I hope that it's about something broader, and the title, I think, maybe allows it to be a bit broader than just the story of this very small unit in the Palmach at the inception of the state. I blundered into the story by chance. I wrote a book about the Aleppo Codex, this manuscript, which spent a lot of time in 600 years in Aleppo. One of the characters in that book was an old Mossad agent named Rafi Siton, who was retired. He was in his mid-80s when I interviewed him. And Siton is one of the big Aleppo clans. Rafi told me at some point that I should meet a friend of his, an even older spy, also from Aleppo. And as I read in the book, I've learned that if someone offers to introduce you to an old spy, go. Even if you don't know why you're going, you're not going to be wasting your time. So I made the long journey to Bat Yam, which is kind of a southern suburb of Tel Aviv, mostly working class.
All my relatives ended up there. Go ahead.
Yeah, heavily Middle Eastern, a lot of former Soviet Jews living there. I found Isaac Shoshan living in a very Soviet-style block of apartments on the 7th floor in a very small apartment, and he was waiting for me at the door. He's about this tall. He comes up to my shoulders, and I sat down in his kitchen, and he made me coffee with a finjan, which is a pot with a long handle of the kind famously used in the Palmach. And he sat me down, and he told me this story about the founding of the state that I had never heard before. And it was so strange to me that I actually didn't understand it the first time I went to see him. I kept going back with my digital recorder. He was almost 90 at the time, and I wasn't sure how much time I had, and I just kept calling him, saying, "Yitzhak, I'm coming tomorrow. Yitzhak, I'm coming tomorrow." And he didn't know exactly what I was after, but I kept going back until he got used to speaking to me, and I got hours and hours of him on tape. And then from that, I was led to other oral testimonies left by other members of the Arab section, all of whom had passed away. Isaac was the only one still alive when I started looking into this story in 2011. And then I went to the military archive and I requested declassification of Arab section files, which were still secret 70 years after the war. They'd been put together with the Mossad files, and they had a certain level of classification, and I had to get that removed. And they ended up giving me a lot of files that included the radio traffic between headquarters in Israel and Beirut in the early years, and in the early, I guess, weeks and months and years of the state. If the word headquarters evokes like a gleaming skyscraper in Tel Aviv, headquarters was the corner of a shed on a kibbutz called Givat HaShlosha. There's a picture of it in the book. It was just a wooden table with a Morse transmitter. That was Israeli intelligence headquarters. And they were writing down the message traffic in pencil on paper, and they gave me the pieces of paper. And I realized that there's a lot of material here that had never been published, and that it was a great story, both a great spy story and a great human story, and also precisely the story that I'd been looking for in order to make this point that's so important to me, and I think was important to you before it was important to me, about the Middle Eastern nature of the state. And I thought a new creation story for the state of Israel would be a good place to start if we're telling new stories and trying to kind of rejig our understanding of the state to put the Jews of the Middle East in the center instead of on the margins.
Wow. So that's how you really came to know the quote unquote the Arab section and all that. Before we go on, I'd like to stop you about the finjan of coffee, because I could tell the way he wrote about it, like he was really interested in it. And we have people in the audience from Egypt who can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was what my mother used to make, kafe Türk, Turkish coffee. And I think the Arabic word, could someone correct me if I'm wrong, is tanaka? Am I right? No? Yes, all right. So you would just use that. Everybody had it in their home, and you would make café turc, and it was sort of the essential appliance in every sort of home I knew growing up.
So the Palmach adopts a lot of that stuff. They like the style, and they like brewing coffee over an open fire, and incredibly, some of this ends up being part of the Israeli military culture, which I only learned when I wrote this book. But when I was a soldier, there was a rule that when you make coffee with a finjan, of course, over a fire, you have to boil it 7 times. And no one knew why. This was just something we did. I thought that was how you had to make the coffee. In Canada, we don't have finjans and coffee and armies and things like that. And I mean, maybe we do. I'm not sure, but
Not in Toronto. Yeah.
the seven times thing comes from these guys. That was their tradition. You had to boil it. You had to boil it once, take it off the fire. Boil it twice, take it off the fire. So they introduce all of these traditions, which begin with the Palmach. Their slang, the Arabic slang that they use, becomes Palmach slang, and it becomes Hebrew slang, and it's still used. So if you know the story of the Arab section, a lot of aspects of current Israeli life become more clear.
Wow. And you were able, through these amazing documents you got access to, that you were able to persuade them to declassify, to kind of bring back to life. I assume, does the Arab section still exist, incidentally?
No, the Arab section was dismantled in 1950.
Okay.
It was the last part of the Palmach to be dismantled. It couldn't be dismantled because it was in Beirut.
Right.
And these guys were in Beirut. They weren't in the state. In fact, when the Arab section agents are sent out of pre-state Palestine into the Arab world, there is no state. They're sent in April 1948. And they spend the first 2 years of Israel's existence as Palestinian refugees in Beirut. And they're only extracted from Beirut in the spring of 1950. They come back to the state of Israel, where they have never been. They have never set foot in a state called Israel. And they've been given ranks in something called the Israeli army, they've never met anyone from the Israeli army. They were just guys in Beirut with this radio transmitter. So cut off from what was happening back home that when the state of Israel was created, they did not know. Because the radio only arrived several months later, and when they were sent out, they had no way of communicating. So when the state's declared in the middle of May 1948, they have no idea. All they know is that the Arabic newspapers are reporting that the Arab armies have eradicated the Jewish enclave. So the Arab armies are in Tel Aviv and Haifa, and they don't know if it's true or not. So if you're an American spy, not that I've ever tried, but maybe there are a few in the audience, if you're an American spy, you know that America exists. So it's hard to be a spy, but you know there's Langley and there's the CIA, and somewhere out there is a country called America. These guys had no country. They were sent in the service of a state that might not have ever been created. And they could have been stranded in the Arab world. That seemed likely, or at least very possible, in the spring of 1948. And they joked that summer, before everything became clear, that that's okay because they could always go back to Palestine as Arabs. That was their joke. And from 2019, it's kind of a joke, but you understand that summer, who these guys are and what exactly is going on is very, very complicated. It's much more complicated than I think it's possible for someone to really grasp in 2019.
It's such a powerful idea, and I'm glad that you've explained, your true title to everybody here, this idea of no country, except it can be applied to so many of us on so many levels. For example, I'm not sure this is generally known, but we, the refugees of the Arab world of Egypt, for example, also had no country because we were considered stateless, literally stateless. So, I've thought about that lately. Why I have, I'm not really sure. But that sort of strange juncture after leaving Egypt, when here we were stranded in France, we didn't have any identity, and how incredibly terrifying that is. But I did find that very moving that you chose to, home in on these characters. So tell me, beyond the documents, your research and quote-unquote reporting with live former spies and what it was like. I loved your line about if somebody, offers to introduce you to an old spy, you never say no. As a matter of fact, for the audience, this afternoon I made precisely such a promise to Matthew. We all have skin in this game. For years I'd heard that a cousin of mine, very close, first or second, was in the Mossad, had risen through the ranks of the Mossad, and was going to be the head of it, but so the family lore went, he was denied that because he was an Egyptian Jew. And he's in Montreal, so of course I told Matti, be sure to meet him when you go to speak in Montreal. And Matti, of course, said, more eagerly than I expected, absolutely. But so tell us about the bonds you forged with the living, and I guess also the dead, and who among the four you chose to profile maybe were your favorites, and how you came to know them.
So the one who is still alive and is still alive
Right.
is Yitzhak Shoshan, Isaac Shoshan. My dream while writing this book was to give him a copy of the book. And I wasn't sure that was going to happen. I interviewed him at first in 2011. He was getting close to 90. Now he's 94, I guess almost 95. And as soon as I got the advanced copy of the book a few months ago, I ran to Bat Yam and I met him at that same mall that I described with his son, and I gave him a copy of the book. And that was a great moment for me. I don't think he's going to read it. He doesn't know English, but he saw that there's
he does not know English.
He doesn't know English. He knows Arabic and Hebrew, and this is him in the middle. And he saw that there's a picture of him on the cover. He would never say this, but I think he felt that he did not receive the recognition that he and his comrades deserved, and I think he's right. So I think that there was some gratification for him in that, and it was an incredible honor and just an amazing thing to have sat with him in his kitchen and a living link with these absolutely wild stories from a time that's very hard to imagine. But I spent a lot of time trying to imagine his friends who have died. And what I had, luckily for me, in the case of two of them, Gamliel Cohen and Yakuba Cohen, confusingly 3 of the 4 spies are named Cohen, which is very Jewish, but they're not related. They're all from different countries, but they're all named Cohen. Like Eli Cohen, there's something interesting going on with Cohen. Why, Cohen is the priestly class in Judaism. So is there something about spying and someone should do, if anyone's looking for a doctoral thesis idea, that you could check that one out, free of charge. For what it's worth. So I spent a lot of time reading these oral testimonies from Gamliel. Jamil was an intellectual. He was the only one who'd finished high school. None of these guys had been to college, but he had a very developed sense of politics, both politics on the Arab side and politics on his own side. He was aware, in a way that I think the others were not, of the ways that he was being looked down on in the state.
Oh.
And he's committed to the cause 100%, and he's willing to die for it. And his position is very interesting and very sophisticated, and he might be the best spoken of the 4. The third one, Yakuba, is brave and very kind of he's a lot of bluster. He's a great storyteller. You have to kind of be a critical reader of the stories, but he's an absolutely incredible character. Yakuba carried out his last mission for Israeli intelligence when he was in his late 70s. At some point, he had plastic surgery to change his appearance, so later pictures of Yakuba don't look like early pictures of Yakuba. He's in a kind of a wild and unpredictable character. Gamliel thinks his job is to collect intelligence. Yakuba thinks his job is to blow things up. And they really don't like each other. And that's clear from the radio traffic because they keep kind of telling on each other to headquarters. Yakuba is trying to blow up the refinery in Tripoli, Gamliel says. And Yakuba says, this guy Gamliel, he's not doing anything. He's just reading the newspaper. So that there's a tension there in the cell that's in Beirut. The 4th member of the cell might be my favorite, and he's the one about whom we know the least. His name is Chavakuk Cohen, of course, and he's a Jew from Yemen. He came to the land of Israel as a child. And Chavakuk is very unique because he's an incredible observer. He just watches. He was a quiet guy by all accounts. He was musically very talented, and he just watched the other side. And he ended up leaving what might be the most incredible document from the 1948 war, which is a description of the fall of Arab Haifa to Jewish forces from the Arab side. He was planted in Arab Haifa as an Arab mechanic. And he was there in April 1948. When the war comes to a head, the British are about to leave. Everything is collapsing. The Haganah, in its first real military maneuver, manages to capture the port of Haifa. And that's really ground zero in many ways for the Palestinian tragedy, because that's when a wave of refugees flees Haifa heading north. And Yakuba sees it all from their side. And he writes this incredible intelligence report, which is really kind of an anthropological document. He's empathetic, he's dispassionate, he's fair, he identifies with them, even though he's not them. It's absolutely amazing, and I devote a whole chapter of the book to that document, and that's one reason that I kind of love Habakkuk. We don't know a lot about Habakkuk because he didn't live long after the 48 war. He was killed by a double agent immediately after the war. He was ambushed by by a contact who he was supposed to be meeting, and all we have of him are bits and pieces. We have a love story, kind of a tragic love story that's true, and we have these documents that show a really keen observer and a really interesting mind.
Right. I was curious about surviving family members, how, if they played a role in your research, if there were children, grandchildren, great.
There are, in the case of Isaac,
Right.
Gamliel, and Yakuba.
Right.
I often find that children and grandchildren don't necessarily know that much
Right.
about the older generation. Yakuba's widow is still alive, Mira Cohen, and I had a chance to sit with her and speak to her on her kibbutz, and that was really amazing. She was also a Palmach fighter.
Oh,
And her brother died in the Palmach. So they're from this incredible generation. She's Yemeni in background. Maybe the most interesting was Gamliel's family, because Gamliel, Jamil, ends up undercover after the 48 war for about a decade and a half. He lives under the same false identity that he's using in the book, Yusuf el-Hamed, but his family is part of the cover story. That's how deep his cover is. So he has a wife who's a Syrian Jew who's also part of the cover, and he has two daughters who are born undercover and don't know they're Jewish. He has a daughter who I spoke to just before I came to North America, whose name is Mira, but she was born with the name Samira. And they gave her an Arab name, Samira, because they knew that when they went back to Israel, they could just drop the Sa, and she would have a Hebrew name, Mira, but she was born with the name Samira. His wife told me that she gave birth in Europe under an assumed identity, and one of the many things she had to remember while giving birth was not to scream in Hebrew.
oh my God.
So this is an incredible generation. When you measure yourself against them, you feel very small. But I had it was an honor just to sit and speak with these people. The book is critical. It's not mythology. It's not ideological. It's not Exodus. For those looking for Exodus, we're kind of past that stage, and I have a lot to say about things that didn't work out and the moral ambiguity of what they're doing. In one case, a sabotage operation that they successfully carry out kills a lot of people who maybe shouldn't have been killed, and that comes back to haunt them. So it's all here, but I think this really is a love letter to these four guys and to what they accomplished and to their generation with all of its complications.
Right, that's a wonderful phrase, a love letter. Just really quickly, and again, realizing that we don't want to bring politics, but since you mentioned, I was also struck by the passages on the Palestinian refugees. And I wondered, since that has become such an enormous political issue, their story told ever louder with time, if it changed your outlook, because in a sense you were getting firsthand reports about what really happened. I'm just curious whether what influence it may have had on your thinking.
I've always tried as a reporter to kind of keep my eyes open and tell the story. I'm not kind of selling ideological narratives. There are many sides in this conflict. I don't think it's even correct to say there are two sides. It's a much bigger conflict than Israelis and Palestinians. It's a Middle East-wide conflict. Most of Israel's wars have not been against Palestinians. Right? In 48, they're fighting Egyptians, Jordanians, Lebanese, Iraqis, and a kind of pan-Arab force called the Arab Liberation Army, and I think I'm forgetting one army. Israel's most potent enemy at the moment is Iran. Those aren't Palestinians. They're not even Arab. So there's something much broader going on, right. But there's nothing about being an Israeli patriot that requires me to reject the suffering of the other side or to ignore it or to pretend that what clearly happened didn't happen. We saved ourselves in 1948. These guys saved us, right? And other people paid a very steep price for it. Jews paid a steep price for it. 6,000 Jews were killed in that war, 1% of the population, of the Jewish population. And a lot of people were made homeless, about 720,000 people, according to the counts at that time. And about 850,000 Jews who lived in the Islamic world for complicated reasons that were largely connected to the founding of the state, but not only, were also made homeless. And a lot of them ended up in Israel. And the loss of the Jewish world of Europe is something we're very conscious of. If you grew up in North America, you know about that, and we're kind of part of that story. But another Jewish world was lost in the 20th century, and we don't care. And it's not even really considered a loss, because they came to Israel, and that's okay, and there was nothing. But there was an incredible, rich, old world in these places that was native. They hadn't floated in from somewhere else. It wasn't like they were there for 20 years. They were there for 2,000 years in some of these places, and it's gone. The Great Synagogue of Aleppo, when it was shuttered in the early 90s, was the longest functioning synagogue in the world. Jews had been praying on that site since the 5th century CE, and there's nothing in the European Jewish world that comes close to the age and depth of the Jewish roots in those countries. So I think that we need to appreciate that that something was gained here, of course, something very dramatic, and Jewish history has been revolutionized, but a lot was lost by a lot of people. And I think we can recognize that. It's 2019, and if your worldview is really threatened by empathy and by facts, then it's not strong enough. And I've always thought that my worldview is strong enough to withstand contradictory facts or facts that make me uncomfortable.
Right, except I guess I would say to that, Matti, that there's been an enormous eagerness to listen to one narrative, and an enormous lack of eagerness to hear the other narrative. Is it that complicated, the loss of the Jews of the Arab world? I'm not sure it is. I think the founding of the state of Israel sort of brought it all to a boil, and one by one they had to leave. But in any event, it was fascinating to read the first hand material. One other small political question, but I couldn't resist. This afternoon, as I was going through the book again, I came across the following lines. He writes about, spyhood and the necessity of acquiring a quote-unquote double identity. This will send shivers. Double identity has always been part of life for Jews. Members of a minority often outwardly indistinguishable from the other. And then he writes a little more about that, and then he comes back and he says, in the real world, this characteristic has fed the idea that Jews are tricking everyone with their appearance while reporting to a secret conspiracy. That is, that they're all a kind of spy. And I thought, oh my God. And I thought of what we lived through this week, right, with Congresswoman Omar, and precisely her allegation that there are, double loyalties going on. And here you've recorded it. And I just, you can tread lightly if you wish, but I'm just curious about your own reflections and thoughts about that. I mean, you have to admit your words are like they could have been written, yesterday.
Well, I'll admit
or whenever
that.
the debate was. Yeah.
I see that Judy's signaling that it's almost question time, but I'll answer that question.
And then we'll sure.
Gamliel is in Beirut in 1949. It's very early on in this story. And the agents of the Arab section understand that their world, which is the Jewish world of Arab countries, is collapsing. And their families are fleeing. A lot of them are fleeing to Israel, and there's violence against Jews. There are pogroms in different places. There's a riot in Aleppo that kind of guts the community, and it happens in other places. And Gamliel, under his identity Yusuf al-Hamid, joins a nationalist party called the SSNP, the Syrian Socialist National Party. I hope I'm getting that right. Kind of a fascist-y party that was active in Syria and Lebanon. It's headed by a guy named Antoun Saadeh, and he's a member of the party. And there are pictures in here that he takes at party rallies. He goes to hear a speech by Antoun Saadeh, who's this guy who's leading this kind of brown shirty type party. And in the speech, Saadeh goes after the Jews of the Arab world. He says, these people are not us. They might speak Arabic, they might live here, but they're not us because they're loyal to the Zionists and they'll betray us. Us. Now, that's very interesting. Saadeh is a Christian, an Arabic-speaking Christian. And the Christians in the Arab world are allowed to be Arabs. They're Christian Arabs, right? Everyone knows that. But the Jews of the Arab world are not really invited into the Arab story, and they don't really want to be there. They have a different idea about what they're doing. But Saadeh in 1949 is playing on the dual loyalty theme inside the Arab world. These Jews who've always lived here, the people from the Jewish quarter, which was here before Islam, these people are actually not one of us. They're spies, and there's a spy craze in Beirut. Everyone's suspected of being spies. There are all kinds of strangers around. And who are these Jews anyway? Are they connected to the Jews who just won the war in Palestine? Or are they Arabs? Who are these people? And this hostility ends up destroying the Jewish world of Islamic states. But it's a much broader theme in Jewish history, this idea that Jews are something else. We're about to celebrate the holiday of Purim. And if you've read the book of Esther, that's the story in the book of Esther. There's a woman in Persia who has a Persian name, Esther. It's a Persian name. She also has a Hebrew name, Hadassah. And she's planted as some part of a kind of a divine operational plan in the palace so that at a key moment she can swing the king against the evil advice of the vizier Haman. But she's playing with her identity in a way that seems kind of modern. Joseph, the story of Joseph. Joseph is a kid from the land of Canaan. He's a Hebrew kid in complicated circumstances. He ends up in Egypt, rising in the palace of Pharaoh as an Egyptian official with an Egyptian name. His name is Tsofnat Pa'aneach. That's his Egyptian name. He's so Egyptified that when his brothers show up in Egypt, they don't recognize him. They think he's Egyptian. Moses, the father of the Jewish people, is an Egyptian prince. So this is a very old idea in Jewish history that there are a few different things going on. So the Mossad doesn't invent it. In the 1940s, there's a panic in Palestine. The British who rule Palestine are afraid that the Germans are about to invade. So the British freak out and the Jews freak out, and they get organized. And the British want spies. They need people who can spy behind German lines. And they realize that although ethnic impersonation is very hard to pull off, what they have in Palestine is a group of people who can pull it off in dozens of different countries. So they set up something called the German section, which is made up of German Jews who are trained to be Nazis. And they train in German uniforms in a cave outside a kibbutz, and there's Nazi flags, and they sing, Wehrmacht songs. There are pretty incredible descriptions of it. They were supposed to be sabotage agents after the German invasion of Palestine. It's at the same time that the British set up the Arab section, because they need people who can serve behind German lines in the Arab world. That's the roots of this story. So they understand that this Jewish double identity is useful. And these guys put those double identities to work, creating a state where the double identity problem can be erased. Because the Zionist movement, one of the key ideas of the Zionist movement is that we can't have these double identities anymore. That this is killing us quite literally. We're not normal. What Polish Jews, Russian Jews, Arab Jews, what is this? We need to be one thing. Today we'd call it Israeli. At the time they would say maybe new Jews or Zionists, but they were trying to create a simple, singular identity, and it's done in part by harnessing the very complicated identities of the people who were in Israel at the outset. At the very same time, in Europe, the double identity thing is leading to the greatest tragedy in Jewish history. The Germans become convinced that this insidious threat to Germanness is so dangerous that they have to kill everyone. And that's what they do. They set out to do it, and they actually do it. There's a certain kind of discrimination that's faced by people who look different, and there's a different kind that's faced by people who seem like you but aren't you. Who are these people? Who are they really reporting to? And that's a key theme in Jewish history. It's in our own scriptures. It's in the way other people have seen us. It's part of the story of intelligence. you would kind of hope that it would have gone away, but it hasn't, and it's present in Europe, and it's present in the Middle East, and unfortunately it's also present in the United States.
In Washington, D.C., apparently. That's what's so horrifying and amazing. Well, good. I guess before we turn to questions from the audience, I wonder, I guess the only remaining question I had for you is Israel today. Yes, you've given us a good effort about how they've tried to eliminate differences and make us all one. But have they? I mean, and what is the status of the, call them what you will, Mizrahim, Sephardim, Arab Jews today? Is it noticeably better? Is there no difference whatsoever?
In some ways, it succeeds to the misfortune of the intelligence services. Because one of the secrets of the success of Israeli intelligence in the first decades of the state, which is when the Mossad really makes its reputation, is that they have many, many people who can pass. They have this incredible reserve of Jews who are native to the Arab world and can speak perfect Arabic. Their children can't, because Zionism works, and they're Israelis, so they don't want to speak Arabic, just like people don't want to speak Yiddish. But the role of Arabic, the place of Arabic in the state is very complicated. That's the language of the enemy. So no one wants to speak it, and within one generation it's gone, and now the grandchildren of people like Isaac and Gamliel, they're not Arabic. They're not native Arabic speakers. They've become Israelis. The idea succeeded, but that doesn't mean that all Israelis are equal. If you go to a development town, to a poor town in the south of Israel, for example, you'll see that most of the people there are Jews from the Middle East. If you go to a university faculty, you'll see that most of the people there are Jews from Europe. The political system is and the numbers, the statistics show the economic divide that is closing, but it's still far from being closed. The ethnic gap, that fault line, is incredibly important in Israel. It's real, it's painful. There's a long history of humiliation that doesn't go away just because people begin to say the right things or feel bad about it. That drives a lot of the voting pattern in Israel, by the way. People haven't forgotten that the labor Zionist establishment treated Jews from the Middle East with disdain when they arrived. And that Begin and the Likud did not, and that still plays out in our voting patterns. The political system is changing. If you look at just kind of the A-list of our politics, you'll see that the finance minister Moshe Kahalon is Libyan, and the culture minister, Miri Regev, is North African, and the justice minister, Ayelet Shaked, is half Iraqi, I think. More interestingly, the head of the Labor Party, which is the bastion of Ashkenazi labor Zionism, is Avi Gabay, who's also Moroccan. So things are changing, but they haven't changed. And if you come to Israel, that's maybe the most important thing to know about the place today.
Right, that's interesting. It makes me think of the French line, plus ça change, plus ça ne change pas, right? And yeah, I think still a problem, unfortunately overall. Well, I would love to, unless you have any more, I'd love to open this to the audience, and if you could choose questions.
Thank you. Great evening. Was Eli Cohen part of this group, number one? And number two, were there any monumental intelligence reports that changed the history of Israel?
I'll just repeat the question. Eli Cohen, is that a name that's familiar to people in the audience? The question is, was Eli Cohen, beyond being named Cohen like all of the spies, was he related to this operation in some way? He was much later. Eli Cohen is an agent who penetrates the highest levels of the Syrian regime in the early 1960s under an assumed identity. His name is Kamal Amin Thabit, and he's caught and executed. He's hung in Damascus in 1965. He's a much later incarnation of these guys, but he is very much a descendant. The guy who runs Eli Cohen is the same guy who masterminds the Arab section, who is, we didn't mention him, but he's an Iraqi Jew named Shimon Somech, who's famous in the Israeli intelligence world, but not known outside it. Shimon both really invents the idea of mista'arvim in Israeli intelligence, and he's also the guy in charge of Eli Cohen. So we hear about the spies who are caught. It's It's one of the ironies of the intelligence world. We know about Eli Cohen because he was caught. We don't know about the Eli Cohens who weren't caught. And in fact, when Gamliel Cohen, no relation to Eli Cohen, when Gamliel Cohen died in 2002, one of Israel's most important military historians said, Gamliel Cohen was one of Israel's greatest agents. We never heard of him because he was never caught. So Eli Cohen is famous, and he was a very successful agent apparently, but he's famous because he met a tragic end. You hear less about the guys who didn't, perhaps ironically.
Just a small postscript about Eli Cohen. I had the opportunity to listen to a family member who came to speak about at my synagogue about him, and told really harrowing stories about how the Israeli spy establishment really let him down and was probably responsible for his capture and death by letting him stay too long, by not pulling him out immediately when there were intimations that his identity was being caught. So I just passed that along because it was extraordinary.
Thank you for such an interesting dialogue. I wanted to ask, did women participate in the Arab section?
It's a great question. I wish that the answer was more yes than it has to be. At the very beginning of the Arab section, the British bring women into the picture because they know that single men draw attention in the Arab world. You're not supposed to be single. It's a bit suspicious, and they know they need women. The problem is, the early people running the Arab section is that, as Lucette probably knows, if you're from a Middle Eastern Jewish family, they're not into letting the girls go off with strange men on crazy adventures by themselves. And they can't find...
No.
No. They can't find very many people. They do find a few, mostly of Yemeni backgrounds. One of them is quoted in the book, and she was taught to use a knife. She was trained to be a mistarevet. This is in the early 1940s, in the first incarnation of the Arab section under the British Special Operations Executive. But her main concern, by the way, she said, was not the getting killed part and not the using a knife part. She was worried about being alone with her male partner. That was her main concern. The British incarnation of the section is dismantled pretty early on. They never use the women. So when they're sent into the Arab world, they're sent just men, and that causes all kinds of problems. Isaac becomes involved with a Christian woman in Beirut, and it almost undermines the whole operation. So that's part of the story. But as for the Arab section itself, it is a male operation.
Yeah, you touched on this towards the end of your talk. But really, if you look at Israeli history, the reign of the Ashkenazim after the state of Israel went from basically 48 to 77. When Begin came in, there was exhilaration in the streets amongst the Sfaradim, amongst all the groups who trickled in the 50s, the Moroccans in 62. And it was jubilation. He didn't even understand what this was about. And the launching of Beirut just changed the entire political scenario. And I think it's a major, major change. This was Camp David, after all. It was just that period, which was just insanity in the streets over there.
Absolutely.
Because they started to get enfranchised.
That's
and
right.
I just wanted to hear what your
No,
perspective
absolutely. I mean,
is.
Menachem Begin is a guy from Poland, and his immediate leadership group is Ashkenazi, but he is aware of this in a way that the labor Zionists aren't. He has more respect for religion. His take on the Arab world and the chances of peace with the Arab world more closely track the attitudes of Jews who came from the Arab world, which is ironic. He signs a peace agreement with Egypt. It's him who signs a peace agreement with Egypt, not the left. So that's very interesting, and I think there's an insight there. But one of the key incidents that leads up to that incredible election victory in '77 is really an ethnic. There's a little. It was big, an ethnic incident. A comedian named Dudu Topaz gives a speech in support of the Labor Party, and he disparagingly describes Likud voters as chachchachim. Chachchachim means Jews. It's a disparaging term for Jews from the Middle East. And Begin picks up on this, and he's speaking to a crowd, and he says, over there, the elitist Ashkenazim, who are, by the way, they're really poor refugees from Poland and Russia, right? It's not a landed aristocracy, but they have certain blind spots. He says, over there, they're calling us chachchachim. And he tells this story about his two famous comrades from the Irgun, the underground, the rightist underground before the state. One is Barazani and the other is an Ashkenazi. They're in British prison, and rather than go and be hanged by the British, they smuggle a grenade into the prison in an orange peel, and they blow themselves up. And he said, look at that, Ashkenazim, Sfaradim, Yehudim, Jews, and he wins the election. In the mythology of the election, that's how he wins the election, by addressing specifically that. The base of the Likud party has always been heavily Middle Eastern in origin, and as I said, that's a very important part of our voting patterns to this day. Right. But the Ashkenazim were in power, so you can disparage the people in power. But yes, of course, it goes both ways, but the imbalance of power, at least for many decades, was pretty clearly in favor of one side. One more question?
Hi. What do you think happened to the missing pieces of the Aleppo Codex?
Well, this should only take 3 or 4 hours, so I'm sure that you guys, you don't have anywhere else to be. I wrote a whole book about it. As far as I know, no significant information has emerged since I wrote the book, which I say with some regret and some pride as a journalist, because I covered all my bases. I think that the bulk of the missing pieces of the Aleppo Codex, one of the great Jewish mysteries maybe, they exist. They weren't burned, they weren't destroyed, they were stolen, and they exist. And I have a few possible directions of inquiry in my book. Without a search warrant and a time machine, I can't really do more than I've done. But in the book, there are a few educated guesses about where they might be. I hope that we'll see them surface in our lifetime. I just want to thank Lucette for doing that wonderful conversation. And thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
I'm not running out. I'll be signing books outside. Thank you to the folks from the Center and Judy and the Natan Prize, and thank you very much for coming.
Please join us for a reception and book signing.